It's great to be with all of you. I can't believe you're all on this line on a Saturday morning, over 100 of you. And I'm really, really thrilled to be with you. These are interesting times, and I can't think of a more dedicated, a more flexible, a more compassionate, a more risk-taking, loving group than youth leaders. And I know that a lot of people put a lot of expectations on you to somehow fix the world that we're in, or save their child, or somehow make everything go back to normal, which is an insurmountable task and one that's unfair to you. But you hold that with grace, and you hold it with patience, and you hold it with giving your all. And my heart is so tied with yours. And the last thing that a seminar should be is one more I don't know, hour of telling you what to do on top of everything else. So let's just say this: you've shown up. That's enough. You're doing great work. That's what matters. Take a minute to just rest in that. And if we talk about something today that inspires you, or sets you free, or gives you inspiration, great. But let's let that be gravy. Let's just sit in the moment to say, God has called you to stand with the students that you get to be with. And that's more than enough. You've done it. Congratulations. Rest in that in our time today. Sound good? So it's no surprise to you that if you've been in youth ministry more than 6 months, that young people have changed, okay? There's a lot of different reasons for that, but we just see that there's something going on where, you know, just youth ministry culture and challenges and stories are constantly changing, which makes youth ministry actually quite difficult, right? Like if we were all sort of first century church historians, like, you know, like that doesn't really change. Like that happened. Like, so you can go back and study it in different sort of ways, but whatever happened, happened. But we as youth leaders are sort of always on the improv. We're always having to sort of think about what's coming, what's sort of been left behind, what's in the future. And so this makes youth ministry really, really difficult. And so if young people have changed, you know, why should youth ministry stay the same? Okay. Now, for some of you, that's a really scary question. Like, I just figured it out, and now you're telling me I've got to change it. And others of you have this sneaky suspicion that the stuff that we do is kind of okay, but it doesn't seem to be keeping up with the rapidly changing worlds of young people, right? Now, that's not a value statement. That doesn't mean that you're doing something bad. It doesn't mean that you're failing. It only means, I think if we love young people, we recognize the fact that sometimes we feel this tension between who they are and what we have to offer, and there's a dissonance associated with that sometimes. And so how do we think about that? How can we actually sort of continue to reinvent ourselves to think about youth ministry as we live in this rapidly changing world? Well, it probably helps for us to just take a minute and just define what we mean by young people, which in itself is a morphing term. So just a little background here. I'm going to give you some definitions. I'm a professor, so I have to kind of like define my terms, right? That's kind of the nerdy thing that professors have to do. So when we think about young people, one of the ways that we can think about it, and a lot of your work is probably associated with this, is just sort of in this realm of adolescence, okay? Now, there was a researcher back in the 90s, David Santrock, that said that adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture, okay? Begins with biology and ends with culture. So that's pretty simple, right? Biology is really when a person moves from being a child to going into puberty, and they move into adolescence, right? Now, in past generations, that was probably age 13. We're recognizing the fact now, biologically, the kids are, especially females, are menstruating and they're moving into puberty as early as 12, 11, 10, years old and sometimes earlier, right? Now, so we see that adolescence is actually moving earlier, right? And at the same time, what we're seeing is that if adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture, the people in our societies, when asked the question, when does one become an adult? A lot of them will answer this way. You become an adult when you're 26, 27, 28, 29. Let's round it up to 30, okay? So if we use this definition of adolescence, of beginning with biology and ending with culture, instead of sort of this transitional mentality of 13 to 18, we now are maybe in a very, very interesting definition of adolescence, looking at a 2-decade journey. This is no longer a transitional period. This is a huge chunk of life where young people are making choices that sometimes can affect them for the rest of their lives. Okay. Now, when we think about adolescence, a lot of researchers were like, okay, look, there's a big difference between an 11-year-old and a 27-year-old, right? So what happened was some research came along and they said, okay, adolescence is probably about 10 to 18, but then 18 to 30, there's this other unique. And so emerging adulthood is really, really unique. Okay, yeah. Great. All right, so emerging adulthood then is this period where at 18, something happens. A young person's life, it moves away from perhaps living under the auspices of a parent or guardian. They have a choice all of a sudden at 18 to go on for more schooling or join the military or get a job or take a gap year. And so all of a sudden their lives are beginning to sort of change, and the options are available to them in some unique ways. What's interesting about this developmental stage, and we don't have time to get into it in this particular seminar, is that the pathways toward adulthood are a little bit more vague than they used to be. There isn't this nice linear sort of approach anymore. There's more options, more opportunities, which is really, really great. And at the same time, this creates a lot of anxiety for young people as well. A lot of emerging adults, though, psychologically sort of think about the fact that about 30, they kind of want to have their traction on life, the people that they want to do life with, the careers that they want to move toward, the beliefs that they sort of want to allow to dictate their lives, okay? So you have this sort of range that's going on there. Now, all that to say, there's probably some other terms that you've probably heard that I'm just going to throw in here just to kind of show how it all kind of matches up. So we also have, all right, hang on a second. What's going on? Oh, there we go. We also have millennials that you've probably heard before, right? These are the people that have wrecked the housing market and have depleted the avocado supply. They're right now about ages 20 to 40, 21 to 41. So when people talk about millennials in your church, they're like, oh, the millennials. Let's just remember, we're not talking about young people anymore. We are talking about people in their 20s into their 40s, okay? So, you know, you could really kind of make some fun with some of your leaders, perhaps. If leaders start complaining about millennials, you could be like, yeah, those 40-year-olds, aren't they terrible? So we also have coming behind them, the Generation Z, or some call it iGen as well. And so they're coming, basically they're sort of in the college age now, kind of moving into the 20s, and you have all this sort of happening right now. So when we think about youth ministry and we think about young people, I think that for us as youth leaders, we are the ones that have to keep our eye on the ball, that this is the range and our scope of care that we think about. And I don't know about you, but maybe you felt like this added responsibility, that I'm no longer caring for a small group of teenagers in a transition period, trying to get them to graduate so they can go on with their lives and I've done my job. I'm realizing that I'm having to care for people for a longer trajectory as they navigate a world that is not as supportive as they used to be in and beyond age 18. These are the kids that I mentored and cared for, and they keep coming back to me. So your scope of responsibility, your care, your vision is bigger than it's ever been before. And this is where, like, I like to tell youth leaders, this is where you take the slide and you take it to your senior leader and you ask for a raise. Like, seriously, like, your job description is like off the charts. And I think we just need to realize that you're carrying quite a bit. And perhaps you feel it. And all I want to show you with this little part of the slide is that if you feel it, it's okay. Of course you feel it. You feel the weight of a world where it takes longer for young people to grow up, that there are new pressures that are put upon them, and there's new need for support for them in some unique ways of which you have felt called to step into. And so keep that in mind. Now, here's the word that we've heard way too often. Maybe the word should be unprecedented. That'd probably be another word, but let's just use the word pandemic here for a moment. This pandemic has sort of come on us, and it's kind of stuck around. I was talking to somebody yesterday. We were like, yeah, remember when people were like tweeting back like last March with the like, wow, it's been 2 weeks in the pandemic. I'm not sure I'm going to make it. Like we're like, what, day 350 or something now? I mean, it's crazy how long we've been sort of situated in this, and it's had a ripple effect on our ministries. Exhibit A, the fact that we're Zooming rather than being together. Now, the pandemic has caused a lot of challenges, and I think that that's true, but I guess I want to just sort of reframe this for a second and recognize the fact that in some ways, the pandemic has been this great disruptor, right? It's sort of turned everything on end. It's forced us to have to do things differently. It's forced us to rethink what we value and what we do, which has a value and also a lot of challenge. I mean, we're all probably a little bit tired of Zoom and trying to make things work and everything else. But I also don't want to just blame everything on the pandemic either. I also think that the pandemic is a great revealer. Again, let me see here. Oh, there we go. It's stripped away some things, right? It's forced us to ask questions about the assumptions of why we do what we do. It's made us ask questions like, well, what is the purpose of youth group? Or what do we do in small groups? Or what is my role? Or how does the church fit in society and serve people, especially young people, right? So there's something about this moment where I'm not going to say the pandemic's great. That's not what I'm saying. But this is more than us just blaming a major event, saying it's wrecked the way that we've done things. It's actually sort of unpacked and maybe revealed the strengths of what we do, but also some of the things that we've done that maybe the assumptions are wrong. Maybe we've come at this in a way that isn't helpful, and we sort of feel that tension and something that's missing there as well. So what do we do about that? Well, in some of the research that we've been doing, we've been sort of rethinking what it means for us to serve young people. And one of the ways that we thought about this is the way young people think about their own narratives in their lives. Okay, I really believe that young people and youth, as they make decisions, these aren't just sort of isolated decisions, good decisions, bad decisions, loving decisions, rebellious decisions. Like somehow they're sort of floating out there and they're sort of grabbing, you know, sort of the flavor of the month, the decisions that they have to make. And our job is somehow as leaders to make sure they grab for the good decisions and not the bad decisions. Like somehow we're supposed to sort of manage their decision making as though that's sort of going out there. I don't find that's very helpful, because here's what I believe. I think that young people are living absolutely perfect in the narratives that they believe about the world. Okay? They see the world in a particular ways, and they're acting in it to survive, live, succeed, how they think the world works. Okay? So if that's the case, we can spend all our time trying to like trick, challenge, inspire them to just make good choices, or we can begin to try to understand the narratives that they're holding in their head that actually are the places that bring the fruit of their narratives along the way. Now, the way that we think about this a lot of times is we use this term. I'm really sorry, I don't know why my screen here is like freezing up. Oh, there we go. What we would call current narratives. Okay, so current narratives are the stories that typically young people believe now. Okay, now that's a mixed bag. Current narratives aren't all bad. Some of them can be really good. There's just a lot of different things associated with that. But a lot of times current narratives fail. They don't quite help young people in the long run, because they start believing something that actually shapes their decisions, and sometimes that doesn't always help them. So let me give you an example. If as a young person, or as a person, if I believe that the world is filled with scarce resources rather than abundance, then I will do whatever I need to do to make sure I get my share, for fear that if I don't, I'll go without. So I will live in competition with my neighbor because there's only so much resource. If I believe a narrative that the world is intrinsically threatening, I've had experiences where that's actually happened, or things are unstable, I will live in such a way where I will position myself to hide and protect myself so that I'm not harmed or called out or in any way damaged by a world that's out to get me. If I believe that the world leans toward particular people, particular privilege, particular race, ethnicity, I will, in many ways, have to deal with maybe feeling incomplete, or that the world doesn't care about me, or that my voice doesn't matter as much, and I will operate in such a way to have to navigate that. You see what these narratives do. They affect the way young people act, speak, relate, right? And we can look at their actions isolated as, well, why did you just like be more gregarious? Or why are you always so sad? Or why are you always so afraid? Don't be that. But if the narratives in my head are telling me that this is the way the world works and I'm trying to survive, they're doing exactly the right thing, because they are adaptable to a world that they view. Now, what's interesting is this, is we know that as Christians, in the world that we operate in, is that God's calling us to something. That there's like this there's these Jesus-centered narratives. And again, this is where my little model breaks down. If there's overlap, right? I mean, there's things going on there. But we, as youth leaders, are entrusted with the gospel, this good news, where we are calling young people to a better story, to a better narrative, to the best kind of life that God promises. And so what we're trying to do in these Jesus-centered narratives is to remind them that they matter, to remind them that there is a world of abundance filled with love and grace, and there's more than enough for them. To remind them that God sees them, and so do we. To remind them that they are endowed with gifts there, where God is calling them to partner with the world, because God is putting the world back together and is inviting every young person to be a part of that as well, right? This is what we are inspiring them toward, because if they begin to believe those narratives, the gospel narratives, the kingdom of God narratives, then they begin to believe it, and they begin to change their behaviors and live into that narrative rather than the ones that are bringing them down. Now, the challenge with sanctification or formation is that there's this sort of mixed bag, right? We all are dealing with a mixed narratives. There are things about my life where I feel like I'm living into a Jesus-centered narrative, and there are things from my past and even my present that are current narratives that I'm still trying to shed. But this is where we get a chance then to work with young people. So here's where the tension is. This is where the work is. And my friends, this is where formation happens. This is where young people actually are wrestling with their lives, trying to make meaning and sense of the world, and trying to find out, is there anybody that's going to journey with me through this? Now, when we think about this idea of formation, we also recognize the fact that this is where ministry happens. And this is what's so courageous about you. You are willing to step into this space, this gap, this whirlwind of narratives, and are willing to try to understand where young people are at, to help them unpack what's going on there, so that as they begin to think about the narratives that they want to lean into, we are there to cheer them on, to help them to see the ways of maybe some of the narratives that are destructive, and help them move in a different direction. And if you're willing to step into that place, you are courageous. That is not the space for the weak of heart. It's like stepping into a youth room and you don't know what to do. There are some of you, all of you in this Zoom, that feel comfortable stepping into that youth room when we get back to those days. but there are people in your congregation that don't want to go near the youth room. You know what I mean? They're like, I am not stepping in that space, right? Why? Because it's crazy. It's scary. It's death-defying. It's heartbreaking. It's beautiful. It's inspiring, all wrapped up in one. Now, I don't have time to get into it, but some of the work that I do, as I think about faith and communities, is that faith has this contagiousness to it. So what it does is as we listen to the narratives that wrestle with young people, it really kind of evokes in us questions of our own narratives. So now we have to deal with our stuff. We have to think about what we're called to. We have to confront the destructive narratives in our own lives, right? So, youth ministry isn't just about helping young people. I mean, it is actually sort of this transformative space where we are laid bare and we become better people. I am a follower of Jesus today, not because I'm a pastor, but because I hung out with young people. So this is where ministry happens. This is where you are at. I don't care if it's virtual or if it's live. This is where ministry happens. So this is the question that I think about with ministry. What's good news for young people? What's good news for our young people? That's what the gospel is, right? Sometimes we think of the gospel as sort of this esoteric, theoretical, what is the gospel? And we can use a lot of theological language, and we can talk about the cross and resurrection, of which we should. But in the end of the day, young people want to know what good news is for them in the narratives that they're living. What's good news for a 12-year-old boy that doesn't have any friends in person, but is awesome with gaming? What's good news for a 17-year-old female that just doesn't feel like her body compares to her friends and she's feeling insecure? What's good news for a 25-year-old young person that just moved from another city into your town and they have no friends? They've just left college where they had deep community and now they don't have any, and they're just looking for a place to belong. What's good news for them? You see, if good news doesn't become something that's tangible and gritty, it's hardly good news. And this is where we need to work. Now, more theoretically, a lot of the ways that we think about this, some of our research is we say, look, this idea of good news is really rooted in three questions that every human being is asking, especially young people, but every human being. Questions of identity, belonging, and purpose. The questions of identity is they're asking is, well, who am I? Like, who am I really? And I would probably say that this is more than just identity. This is identities, right? Who am I from a gender perspective, from a racial, from an ethnic perspective, from a socioeconomic perspective, from a religious perspective, right? All these are at play at the same time. And young people are trying to somehow harmonize their identities so that they can actually really understand who they are, okay? Belonging, where do I fit? Who are my people, right? Like, what does it mean to belong, and what does that look like? And where do I find those spaces? In some of my research with college students, I discovered that young people will belong in even the worst sort of gatherings as long as they're with someone, because it's better to be with a group of people, even if it's a bad influence, than nobody at all, right? So there's this deep desire to feel a sense of connection, to be known, to be seen, right? And then this idea of purpose. What difference can I make? Like, what's my fingerprint on the world? Like, what am I made for? Like, when I wake up in the morning, does anybody care? Like, do I count, right? So these questions are pulsating in people's lives, all of our lives, but especially with adolescents and emerging adults, these are the primary questions, right? Because this is for the first time, they have enough perspective to actually ask these questions, and it actually shapes their future. And so we need to keep these in mind when we think about this idea of ministry, right? Now, how do we become better with these youth leaders to really seeing the narratives of young people and also proclaiming the Jesus-centered narratives? Really quick, I'm going to give you some ideas, some challenges and some ideas, and then we're going to wrap it up, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. Okay, here we go. Number one, sometimes we don't see the current narratives of young people because of something called closeness bias. Now, closeness bias in a very basic form is this. When I become familiar with someone in a relationship, I begin to make assumptions about them and I stop being curious about them. And therefore, I just assume that I know them when actually I don't. So I could be close to someone in a relationship, get lazy in pursuing that relationship. And then what happens is that even though we're close, we really don't know each other and we're strangers. Okay. Now, this is where I want to speak more to the veteran leaders out there. Veteran leaders, sometimes I think that we think that because we've done youth ministry for a long time, that we know young people today. Let me just be really blunt, and I'm in this category. We don't, okay? We can't use our past history to in any way blind us from the vigilance that comes with us understanding who young people are today. And so there's a discipline that comes with us remembering that every new class of students that steps up into, say, the freshman year or in middle school or seniors or whatever one you want to pick, they are not the same as the students last year. They have new challenges, things have changed, and we need to see them with fresh eyes for who they are on their own terms. We need this vigilance, or we will slip into closeness bias and begin to make assumptions about them that actually aren't any true anymore. And these become the blind spots for us to not see the narratives that are there. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is this concept called intragenerational speed, okay? So we've probably heard of the term intergenerational. We use it a lot at the Fuller Youth Institute. We really believe that there's something about intergenerational ministry and about relationships, that the collective community really gives support in young people's quests for identity, belonging, and purpose. The challenge, however, is this, is that the world is moving faster and faster. And because it is moving faster and faster, generations are feeling alienated faster and faster. So in the chart that I gave you before, we talked about millennials and we talked about Gen Z. Did you notice that those terms and those eras were about 20 years in length, okay? The problem with that is that because technology and the world is moving faster, the stuff that I learned even 4 or 5 years ago is in many ways obsolete. So within a 20-year span, we no longer have one generation. We probably have about 4 or 5, okay? Instead of generation, generations. So what happens is that because life is moving faster, the shared experiences that we have between generations, and even within the generations, are less and less, which means we have less in common with some of the ways that we have related to the world. Now, that's not good or bad, it's just what it is. But what it means is that sometimes I think we assume that we've having similar experiences with a younger generation. Let's say I'm older, when in actual fact, the commonality is much less. It doesn't mean we can't have a relationship, but what it means is this, is that I have to work harder toward understanding someone. So if you're an adult, a parent, a senior pastor, an older veteran leader, and you're like, gosh, it seems harder to find connecting points with young people, it's because of intragenerational speed, okay? So we have to, again, think of strategies of how we lean in a little bit more to understand where they're coming from. So what do we do instead? Well, I think what we need to do is to have compassion, right? And this is oftentimes inspired by this concept of empathy, right? Where it's a skill that we learn where we actually perspective take and try to understand other people. Now, my wife Jen and I, we used to have a piece of art in our living room that had 3 words on it: tell me more. And that really became sort of a theme of the ways that we talked with our own kids as they were growing up. As they would come and share something, it would be very, very quick for me as a professor and my wife as a clinical therapist to give awesome advice. And let me tell you something, people pay for our awesome advice. Our kids don't. They're not that impressed. But I found that when I was not as quick to give answers, but actually sought the questions, and instead I would say to my kids, well, tell me more about that. Well, what did you do? Or how did that feel? Or what do you think is next? Or what can I do to help? I found that there was a question behind the question that was actually important to them. And this is where we actually had better conversations and more of generative topics, because I was able to pause long enough to find out what the real issue was, what the real question was, what the real emotion was. And I think this is what we need to do. I think just that simple question can actually be a game changer. I think another thing we could do is, again, it's kind of what I just said, is look for the questions, not just the answers. Sometimes what young people want is not just a quick answer, like somehow we're going to solve their problem of the narrative that they're working through, but they're just looking for some new ways to think about things as they navigate their lives. And we can be there, that journey with them, rather than just give them quick answers. So maybe something that we can do for ourselves and for the parents that we're caring for, families that we're caring for, is just to model curiosity, to not be too quick to assume, to not assume that just because I was a teenager once, I understand teenagers, but instead have a curious posture that allows us to see these current narratives. Now, when it comes to ministry, a friend and colleague of mine, we were having this conversation about, like, when people see a problem, what do they do? And he said something that was brilliant. He just said, I think what they do is they default to default imaginations. I'm like, default imaginations, what's that? He's like, that's when people think they're creative, but actually they just default to what they've done before, right? And this is like, we hear this in youth ministry all the time, right? Like, hey, you know what are we gonna do? Well, last year, you know what really worked was, or back when I was young, you know what everybody really liked was. Do you see what we do? We sort of default to what we did before and have sort of that sort of mentality. But instead, I think what we need to do is we need to lean into our creativity. We need to recognize the fact that as youth leaders, sometimes the answers are not the ones that we've done before, but we have to sort of branch into some new ways of thinking about things. And so there's a discipline that comes with sort of fostering your creativity. Lots of different ways personally we can do that, but also as a team. But I think that's just something that you can do. And, I think just personally, some really simple things that you can do is just read literature that's different than you've ever read before. Or if you drive to the store because you need to go, take a different route, right? Think about ways that your creativity is inspired, because I think that will have an effect on the way you look at problems and how you can serve the young people in your ministry. Now, really quick, some other creative things to think about, and some of you may have heard some of these before, but I'll bring them up, is I think sometimes in youth ministry, we think that it's our job to do everything for young people. Okay, like it's the youth leader's job, like give them, like fix it, right? Let's just remember that we are part of a community and that our young people need people more than us. And one of the things that we talk about in some of our research is this 5-to-1 ratio. And sometimes we always think about the ratio as 1-to-5, like 1 leader to 5 kids, right? Like that's gonna like care for them. But what if instead we helped families find 5 adults that love their young person with no strings attached? Now, that doesn't mean that 5 adults run around with a young person and make sure that they, don't get into trouble. But can a young person actually think of 5 people in their lives that they would go to with a question or that they would trust, right? This is a great question to ask your teenagers as well. Like, who do you trust? Who do you look up to? If you could think of 5 people that are most important to you, who do they come up with? Who might they say? It'll be interesting to see who they look to, trust, and lean on. For those that struggle with coming up with 5, there's nothing magical about 5, but I think that's an opportunity for us to kind of say, well, how do I help them? How do we work with parents to find other adults in their lives that can journey with them? Secondly, I think when it comes to creativity, and I say this to parents all the time, is that we need to be interested in our kids and we need to be interested in our teenagers, and we need to be interesting ourselves, okay? So if you ask a young person, hey, so what'd you do this weekend? Be prepared to answer your own question. Well, what did you do this weekend? Hey, what are you reading? Can you answer what you're reading, right? So what are you excited about these days? Can you answer what you're excited about, right? I think young people need to see that as we get older, like the story continues, the narrative can be inspiring, that life continues. You don't like die at 25, right? There's actually this generative human experience that we have in our creativity. So I think that can be really, really helpful. And then I would just say, as you work with parents, just remember this, youth leaders, is that we always want to give expectation. We want to inspire them to who they can be, but just remember at the same time, we also need to give them support. Both are necessary. Inspire parents, encourage them, but a lot of times what parents need is just some handholds along the way to live up to the expectations that perhaps you give to them. So if you're like, parents, pray with your kids, that's a great thing to do, but you don't give them like any ways to do that, like they're going to be like, that's a great idea. I have no clue to do that. Right. So help parents like win, like help them do that. And I think you'll become a hero for them. Okay, really quick, one more thing and I'm almost done here. When it comes to the Jesus-centered narrative, let me just say the Jesus-centered narrative in its fullest form is the best story, right? I mean, we believe that. I mean, it's gospel, it's good news. But sometimes I don't always think that we're the best storytellers. It's not the gospel's fault, it's maybe our fault, right? So as we teach, as we mentor, as we talk about the good news of Jesus, it's an art form that we want to continue to grow and mature in our own thinking, because I think that really helps young people understand what this narrative is. I think what gets in the way of Jesus-centered narratives are probably two things. One is just they feel like they've outgrown the gospel. Maybe you've heard your students say this, right? Like, yeah, you know what, youth group was great when I was 14, but I kind of outgrew it. You know, I'm kind of on to other things, right? And we're kind of like, what? You know, how dare you say that? No, and but deep down we kind of get it, and here's why: young people are looking for a faith that can keep up with their increasingly complex lives. Young people are looking for a faith that can keep up with their increasingly complex lives. Okay, so as they ask new questions and encounter new challenges as they grow up, they want to know, can the gospel keep up? Is it still good news? Is it relative? And this is the challenge for us, to be able to say to them, yeah, it can. It really can. It's hard, but it can. And we're going to show you how, right? So let's keep that in mind. And then secondly, I think sometimes we can get in the way is when our gospel's faceless and nameless, right? When we traffic in terms of theology that are theoretical, or we talk about issues and we get away from real people, theology becomes shallow and becomes cold and becomes hard. Theology without a face or a name isn't theology anymore, right? We don't talk about LGBTQIA issues. We talk about Janice, talk about Matt, we talk about Davis, right? And so I think we just have to remember that as we talk about the stories of the Jesus-centered narrative, that it's always rooted in real people, in real places, with real lives that we care about. And I think that makes all the difference. So with that in mind, let me see here. That leaves us, come on, there we go. That means that we need to have some courage to go there, right? And I think what I tell parents and adults all the time is I think sometimes in ministry, we think that we're going to wait for the kids to bring up theological issues, but let me tell you the real truth. They're waiting for you. They don't really know how to bring it up. They're not sure if they should. They never know if the right timing. So if you're in a position as an adult or a mentor or youth leader, you go first. You ask them about their spiritual lives. You make that topic a topic that's fair game, right? So create that space for spiritual conversations to happen. And I tell parents all the time, if you don't know what to talk about spiritually, then just tell your story. Like, how did you start doing Jesus things? Like, why does that matter to you? Like, I think that young people actually want to know that. And if I could throw a theological term, ontologically, we always want to know where we've come from, even with our spiritual stories as well. And it really is helpful sometimes as for parents to tell their story, because it makes sense and gives meaning to young people as to why we do as a family what we do, et cetera, or as a mom or a dad or whatever. So, I think that would be great. And I think here's the moment for youth leaders as you work with parents as well, to keep in mind that your job is to resource parents, not replace them, right? There are things that parents need to do that only they can do. And your job is to do whatever you can to set them up to succeed, because you can't be everybody. You can only be you. You are only one of the 5 that they need in their lives, and this is where you can really step in and do that. So that'd just be another thing to think about with that narrative. Now, there's some things that I just want to let you know about. This idea of compassion, creativity, and courage is some of the research that we just came out with, a book that we just released last week called Sticky Faith Innovation. You're more than welcome to check that out. We've just launched a new blog, a new podcast series that just started this week. So it's all that stuff's free, and you get a chance to talk more about this idea of innovation and where we think we're going with the future. And also, if you're looking for a resource for parents, this our book Growing With, as Cheryl mentioned before, is just a great resource with questions that parents can work through. And really, sometimes, Kara and I'd say, we wrote Growing With because we wanted this book when we were youth leaders, right? Like, we just, like, parents are always like, do you have a book? Like, we finally felt like, well, we just got to write it. So maybe you'll find that helpful as well. So let me just leave you with this, and then we'll do a Q&A. Let's just hope that the pandemic can maybe be a great opportunity. That this is a season of permission where people are looking to you, youth leaders, in some unhealthy ways, but let's look at it in this way, in some really beautiful ways. They see you as closer to their kids than maybe they are. They see you and your love for young people, and they are looking to you to give them some hope and some ways forward in this time. And so may you lean into your role. May you have confidence that God has called you to the role that you are in. And may you have joy in knowing that what God has called you to is not just for young people, but it's also for your own transformation. And may you know God's grace and peace.
A couple questions have come in. So
yeah,
quick, if you can just answer off the top. From Prince, he said, what's the book called? Sticky Faith what?
Sticky Faith Innovation. So stickyfaithinnovation.com. You can just Google that, and you'll pop up. You'll see a bunch of resources there associated with that. We use that term. Sticky Faith was a research project that we did about 10 years ago about helping young people develop their faith. Some of you probably are familiar with that book. If you aren't, that's okay. But this is sort of in that sort of vein and that sort of line. So that's why we called it that. And the research was done with over 100 churches and a couple hundred youth leaders over the last 4 years, really trying some things out. So this is sort of some tested material that we've done with people just like you.
Thank you. Joe Grider, if you don't mind, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
I can. So my question was, your original construct was around the fact that youth are from 10 to 30. And yeah. I really appreciated, and it resonated with me, the idea that we each have this negative narrative that we have to overcome. Yeah. My question is, as a leader, is it not part of our responsibility to not only meet them where they are in that false negative, but to help them understand that despite, not just to accept it, but that despite it, they need to move forward to be an adult. So I guess in to elaborate on the question, if I have a youth in my group who's 18 and getting ready to graduate high school, I understand they have all those false negatives or false narratives. Yeah. I'm more than twice their age, and I still have all those false narratives. And what the gospel does for me is it inspires me. It provides an avenue that I can leverage to overcome those. Isn't it my responsibility to teach them to do that at 18? Because while it's fine that our construct says they're not adults till 30, their mistakes the day after they turn 18 are just as real and just as long lasting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Keep going.
I don't know if my questions, I just didn't know if my question was clear in that. That's all. Sorry.
No, it's great, Joe. I appreciate that. And so it would be great to have a further conversation with you. But here's the deal that I think is really crucial, is that I think you're right. It is our job to teach and to provide for them a vision for what life can be as they move toward adulthood. But I think the mistake, and I'm not saying you're making this, but I think a lot of mistakes that people make about emerging adults is that it's their choice. Like they're like just a new narrative is going to solve the problem for them. The reason young people have a hard time growing up has to do a lot of times with the economy. It has a lot to do with the fact that the way society conceptualizes adulthood is so vague that they don't even know what that means. And so they're stepping into a world of ambiguity and less support that makes it harder for them to grow up. So I think the ways that we can teach them is what's really important is this, is that the false narrative is to think that the 20s is basically adolescence all over again. Like, that's not true. But I think what Meg Jay, psychologist, would say is that the 20s are a time of investment, where we're really sort of thinking about, how am I investing in the life that God wants me to have by the time I reach 30? And so that's part of our job, I think, as ministry leaders, is to paint that sort of narrative so that we don't somehow just coast through our 20s and then everything just sort of works out in their 30s, right? So, and I can't think of a better institution to do that than the church, right? You got all this resource, all this experience, all these mentors. Like, the church is the best place for those in their 20s to actually maybe find that support along the way. And I'll say one more thing. Let's just remember that a lot of youth leaders are in their 20s. Like, we're not talking about people out there. Like, the people that are in your church that are loving your students are trying to navigate life in a world that has changed dramatically. So let's give them the support that they need as well.
Appreciate it. Thank you. That
yeah,
elaboration helps a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate the question, Joe.
So we have also a question from Kara Lee. What about not having a designated youth minister, but instead you're integrating youth work into all the jobs of your church staff? What are the pros and cons for a situation like that?
Yeah, so that's a reality with a lot of churches, right? And so I appreciate that question. So you asked for pros and cons. So here's the con. I'll start with that because I want to end in a positive note. The con is my colleague Cara Powell always says, if you want to starve a horse, assign 2 people to feed it, right? Because then what happens? Everybody assumes that everybody else is taking care of the horse. In that case, I'm not equating horses to people. I think I just did that. But you see where the metaphor goes, right? The challenge, I wouldn't say it's bad, but the challenge is that when it's spread over lots of people, no one really owns the responsibility. And I think that what we find with youth is that it's such a fast-moving, intense time that sometimes they deserve a little bit more attention from our institutions, right? So the question then for you is, if you can't afford that, or that's not the vision that you have for your ministry, is to say, well, how do we give attention to young people? And I do think this is where the 5-to-1 ratio really helps. I think collectively as a team or as a group of people, I think you can say our job, us together, is to do what we can to provide environments for young people that allow them to flourish and to live into a Jesus-centered narrative. My guess would be that the work that you have to do there is to have more communication with each other to make sure that you're all sort of on the same page of how you're going to do that. Otherwise, I think everyone will just assume that everyone else is doing it, and then that's when the problems probably arise. The beauty of the shared vision is that I think then you don't sort of silo youth ministry, right? Now a young person begins to see that the whole church or the whole community cares for them, which is absolutely beautiful. There's just sometimes the challenge of, if everybody's responsible, nobody's responsible. But there's certainly some advantages to that as well. That's a great question.
Another one came in from Ronald. It says, how do you keep youth engaged in church and church-related activities when their parents are not as interested in their spiritual walk or growth?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, right? I think we have to remember, and this gets back to the narratives a bit, right? That our young people, as they engage with us, their stories spill into our spaces, right? It's not just about them, it's about the systems they're a part of, the families that they're a part of. I think that can be a really, really tricky thing. Let me make an assumption that I may not be true, but I'm going to make it anyway. I think parents love their kids passionately. And I think they love people that love their kids. So I would ask, and maybe offer to your question this, that if you've got a parent that's uninterested in church, or maybe even a little bit suspicious of church, which is totally fair, right? I mean, you look at church in the news and you're kind of like, you know what? I don't know if I want my kids hanging out with those people, right? But I think if we reach out to parents and say, hey, you know what? Your kid's amazing. They're so interesting. Let me tell you who I am. And let me tell you what we're trying to do at this church. We're just trying to help kids make good choices and live into their best life. And you can call me anytime if you've got any questions, but I want you to know that we're transparent, and you can help me by like, if you think this is valuable, to get them to youth group would be great. And I guarantee that I'll do my best to really support them in any way that I can. I don't know a lot of parents that are going to be like, absolutely not. You stay away from my kid because you care about them too much. Like, parents are looking for help. So I think what we can do is maybe move away from it being about going to youth group and not going with youth group, but kind of finding a way to have a team mentality with parents. I think that can be really helpful. I would do that with my kids all the time, like with like parent teacher conferences. I would just say to teachers, I'm really grateful for you teaching my kid. What can I do? What can we do to be on the same team to advocate for my kid, right? That's a different sort of mentality than like, we've got to take sides. And so maybe that's the way to finesse it. But let me just again say, sometimes it's really difficult, and that tension is really there. And those are really, really hard situations.
Thank you. I think we have just, we have 1 more minute left. So I'm just going to throw this out here. How do you get more people in your church and in your youth group?
Well, there are always negative and positive ways, right? I suppose you can just like drop money from a helicopter. That always gets people there. I think people are looking for the real. I think they want to know that that people say who they say they are, and I think if we can be faithful to what we say we're about, I think people will actually think that we're legitimate. And I think that's one way. I think for the church, I think one of the challenges for the church is that we've lost our space in our community. We don't really know where we fit anymore, which is kind of funny because a lot of our churches, maybe even yours, was like planted in the middle of a town, right? Like the vision for your church was, this town needs us and we need this town and we're going to work together, right? So maybe the question isn't how do we get more people to come to us, but how do we go to them? How do we not let the walls become the barrier, but instead the bridge to the ways that our community needs caring people that want to make the world a better place, right? And so I think that would be another way. And I think the other thing is I think people want to know that everyone's willing to take risks, right? If the risk is you come to my church, who has all the risk? The person coming to my church, right? But if we do an endeavor where it's 50-50, or there's a shared risk, now we all are sort of bought in. And I think that's something that we need to think about as well. So I think it's time for us to sort of reimagine what we mean by church. And attendance and participation are not the same thing. A lot of young people are participating in religious and spiritual activities, but not showing up at church. That doesn't mean they're atheists. It means something else. And I think these are the narratives we need to pay attention to.